Hello, my name is Ben, and today I'm going to be talking about improving teaching by studying learning. You're watching this video as part of the Teaching, Learning, and Technology Center at the University of California, Irvine Supplemental Instruction Program. Basically, this is going to be about how more recent research on learning and memory can lead to better training methods. And specifically, many of the things I'm going to talk about today may actually be counterintuitive, which is probably a good thing because it will really help you in how you design and present instructional information to your students. Let me start by asking you a question. Take a look at this array of pennies and tell me which one is correct. Now, you look at pennies all the time. You probably have had some in your hand yet today, perhaps yesterday. How many times in your life have you actually looked at a penny? Many. However, when you look at this array, how comfortable are you that the one you pick is correct? So the actual correct penny is in the second row, the second one in. And if you didn't get that correct, you are not alone. Most people do not get that correct. And why is that? Well, it has to do with attention. Now, we'll start with a quote from Douglas Adams' Life, the Universe, and Everything. And it's called Somebody Else's Problem. An SEP, he said, is something that we can't see, or don't see, or our brain doesn't let us see, because we think it's somebody else's problem. That's what SEP means, somebody else's problem. The brain just edits it out. It's like a blind spot. If you look at it directly, you won't see it unless you know precisely what it is. Your only hope is to catch it by surprise out of the corner of your eye. And if you think about it, there's a lot of things in our daily experience, in our perceptual experience, that we're just not aware of. We just don't take in that information because we're not prepared to pay attention to that information. So take a look at the two gentlemen in this picture. And this is from a well-known Harvard study that has to do with exactly this, selective attention and something called change blindness. You look at these two men and you say, these guys are not the same guy very clearly. If I showed you a picture of one and then showed you a picture of the second, you would very quickly be able to say, this is not the same person. However, what they did is they did a study by putting one of these men behind the desk, and subjects came in. So often at a university, people will take part in experiments for course credit or because they get paid. And so you would come into this study and you'd come up to the desk and there'd be a person behind the desk. And what you would do is you'd fill out some paperwork and then receive some instructions and go about your business. However, in this case, what happened was once the person finished filling out the paperwork, the person behind the desk took that paper and ducked down behind the desk. And as you see here, the person who was there crawls forward and somebody else takes his place and stands up. And what happens is most people have no idea that the first person has been replaced because they weren't paying attention to it. Some people do notice it, and it's possible they happen to be paying attention to exactly some characteristics of that individual. Perhaps the person reminded them of someone, or they noticed the color shirt the person was wearing. But most people don't notice that they were just talking to somebody who has now been replaced by somebody else. And it's not because they're dumb or foolish, it's simply because they weren't paying attention to the characteristics because it wasn't important. They didn't need it for their worldview. Probably because we're not used to people being replaced. So I'll ask you a question now. What color were the shirts the two men were wearing in the first still? And it's possible you remember, it's possible you don't, because it's just a matter of were you paying attention to this? And here's the picture, and if you got it right, perhaps you were paying attention to it. If you weren't, the information just didn't seem important to you. And that's what we see a lot in instruction. Is this important? So this is actually based on an early study of change blindness where the instructions were to watch the people in the white shirts as they pass the basketball and count the number of times they pass the basketball. And during this video, during the task, in the video, a person dressed in a gorilla costume, as you see in the middle, walked into the middle of the scene, stopped, looked at the camera, and then walked out. After people finished the task, they were asked, how many times did the people in the white shirts pass the ball? And then they were asked, did you notice anything strange about the video? Well, guess what? Most people said nothing about a gorilla or a person in a gorilla suit or even noticed anything strange because they weren't paying attention to that information. Even though, when we look at it, we say, This is certainly out of the ordinary. And the first thing we're going to talk about today is attention, because attention is really the key to learning and to processing information before we even get there. So take a look at this painting. This is from the 14th century, so we're talking about something over 700 years ago. And this is a lecture from the 14th century. So you see the person at his desk at the front looking down over the classroom, and you see all the people in the classroom. And what do you notice about this classroom? Is this very different from today? Certainly they're not wearing the clothes that we would expect, but you see people in the second row are talking, in the third row are talking, in the fourth row are probably flirting. You see the person in the third row who's actually asleep. And how often does this look like any learning experience you're used to? This is not uncommon, so it's not a new problem. When they look at attention, it's hard to say what is a good measure of attention. So what some research did is, and this is from Bly, they said, we're going to measure the heart rate of people, and this is going to be our proxy for measuring attention. What happens to your heart rate over the course of a lecture? Well, they looked at it, and at the beginning of the lecture, your heart rate is higher, and as the course goes on, it drops in a fairly linear way. It just goes down over time. And some studies of this will show a little bump at the end, because often at the end of a lecture, what happens? The professor says, now to sum up. So people are like, oh, this is the important part. I have to write this part down. And yet, this steady decline over time, how much learning is actually happening? Many studies suggest that after 15 minutes, people have very much tuned out and are doing something else or not paying attention. So, test your memory. Do you recall an engaging professor who kept your attention? How about an unengaging professor who kept your attention? Right? So you can think of the engaging one, maybe they're charismatic, maybe they tell jokes, they're funny, they're charming, and you pay close attention to everything they say. But more important right now for our purposes is, what about the one that's not engaging? But you learned a lot from their class. What can you tell me? What do you remember about that? Well, many people, when asked about the unengaging professor they learned a lot from, they say the same things. They say the person was knowledgeable. They say they were a good presenter of information, right? And there was a coherent structure of the presentation. People do well with coherently structured information. And they also say the person's enthusiastic. Even if they're not charming or exciting, they care about what they're saying. And that is passed on to the student. It's very clear. Your relationship with the material is very important. Now, what happens if you do something different? If during that lecture time, you don't just have a professor talk the whole time through? Well, as you can see in this slide here, the heart rate is up, it's down, but it's not stable and it's not dropping, right? It changes over time. And this is because in this case, the lecturer is doing things different. In some cases, the heart rate shoots up because students are speaking. In some cases, students are actually given a short reading. In some cases, the students are having group discussions. So oftentimes, you can adjust for attention, you can improve attention just by stopping and doing something different over the course of that discussion. Now, often your students are going to be learning on their own. And this is a quote from Miller, who summarized how you can improve learning and what college teachers should know about learning and memory. And she says, begin with exercises or framing questions that will engage students. Right? Make them care about the material. Once you have their attention, then cover your material. Their attention to the material, once they've become engaged with the questions that framed it, should improve significantly. They will care more, they will pay better attention if they understand why this material is important. If you take the time to go through a way to present this information to them in a way that matters to them. She also summarizes a few things in her article, and we're going to talk about some of these through the course of this presentation. So consider that the mind does well with relevant, well-structured information, as opposed to consider, here's a bunch of facts, remember these things. Also, people are poor at multitasking, and this is very important to keep in mind. Holding student attention is critical. No attention is no memory, and frequent testing is central to the learning process. Think about all those things. Think times you've been in a classroom, times you've had an experience and you weren't paying attention. And very often you'll find you simply have no memory for these times. Attention is crucial. Next, we're going to talk about processing. So there's different types of processing, and first we're going to talk about how much do you remember from a class you had last year? How much do you remember from a class 3 years ago, and how much do you think you'll remember from a class you're taking now in 10 years? Well, this is a study from Sem and Cole where you see after 3 years, A students remember less than 50% of the information presented in class, and B students are less than a third of the information. And these are not just B students, I'm sorry, B and below. So there's a difference between A students and B and below students. There's a big difference between what they're doing. So what is that difference? You look at time, and after 16 years, you see that the A students actually retain from this class twice as much as the students who got B and below. Now, are A students just smarter than B and C students? Is there really a huge difference in the IQ between A and B students? Or is it possible that our A students are actually doing something different? Perhaps they have better study techniques. Perhaps they're engaging the material in a different way. And that's what we're going to talk about with processing. They suggest that what leads to long-term memory is that material needs to be well learned initially in order for long-term recall. Well, that makes a lot of sense. The more you learn in the beginning, the more you'll remember in the end. And the superior performance of A students shows, not surprisingly, that effort enhances retention. How much effort do you put into studying? Do you have the book open and you glance at the pages? Or are you doing something else? And this is the idea of deep versus shallow processing. So what does this mean? Well, let's take a look at a study that actually kind of looks at the difference between deep and shallow processing through different study techniques. So for 2 prose passages, 2 groups of students were either given a 5 7-minute learning session or 4 7-minute learning sessions and a recall test. And students were retested after 5 minutes, 2 days, and 1 week. Now, just think about this, right? The students who get the 5 7-minute learning sessions, they have more time learning and interacting with the material. The people who get the 4 7-minute learning sessions plus a recall test, which is basically, here's a blank piece of paper, write down what you remember, actually have less time with the actual material itself. But what happens with testing? Well, 5 minutes later, if they were tested, the students who have the extra time with the material, who get an extra study session, do a little better. But that might look like cramming for a test. However, after 2 days and after a week, the effect is very much reversed. Students who stop at the end of their study session, after those 4 sessions, put a blank piece of paper on the table and write down what they remember, have a much improved memory for the material 2 days and a week later. Because something different is happening. They are doing what is called deep processing. The act of reconstructing information is very important compared to the act of simply looking at the information. So think of this deep processing involves something like the self-assessment. You close the book and you write down what you remember. At the end of class, you don't look at your notes, but you write down what the important points were. How much more of that information is going to be in your head, taking that 2 minutes at the end of class to write down the key points after a couple days and after a week than if you simply get up and leave. Surface processing involves traditional studying, reading, observing, looking at the book. But think about what this means. Think about the penny identification task. How good are you? How well could you reproduce any of the money which you handle all the time if you were to do the same task with $1 or a quarter, right? We are interacting with these things, and yet we're not processing them on a deeper level. And they suggest the best studying happens with the book closed. And of course, this doesn't mean closing the book and using it as a pillow. It simply means after you're done studying, take a moment and test yourself. Do something different. A later study was done that actually compared this to other methods, and this is something, another method is called concept mapping, which is where you look for connections between the information. So they compared single study sessions to repeated sessions to concept mapping to retrieval practice, which is basically the closing the book and writing down what you remember. Now, concept mapping means they still get to interact with the material's still there, but what they do is something like this. They draw a diagram of how the material, how the terms, how the ideas relate to each other. So we think, is this deep processing? Often, this is a very reasonable task. You take the information and you operate on it. You're taking notes, you're saying how these things are important, but the information is still open in front of you. It's not the same thing as recreating the information from your memory, but you are doing something with the information. Now, different types of questions were given to students, and often are. So when you have a multiple choice test, or most tests, there's two types of questions, right? There's verbatim questions, which are exactly what you were taught. You know, in what year did X happen? And then you have inference questions, which requires a student to combine information in a new way. What type of questions do students prefer? Well, most students will say they prefer verbatim questions. They want to be tested on exactly what they were taught. And yet instructors tend to like the inference questions. They like to see if you can actually do something with the information, operate on it. So we look at the results of the study for the two types of questions. You have the verbatim questions, and you look at, well, repeated study beats studying. Concept mapping is about the same as repeated study, and retrieval practice is really significantly higher than them all. For inference questions, repeated study and concept mapping certainly are better than a single study session, and again, retrieval practice is better than everything else. So even here, you see a pretty big bump. And how much effort and time does it take to close the book and see what you know? And this is very important because oftentimes for your students, if they're having trouble and they think they know the material, giving them an opportunity to see what they really know is incredible and actually allows them to understand what they know. Research on retrieval practice suggests a view of how the human mind works that differs from everyday intuition, right? We talked about intuition. You think things work a certain way. You think the mind works a certain way, but a lot of the new research is actually looking at just that. Is what you believe true? Do the data support that? Retrieval is not merely a readout of the knowledge stored in one's mind. The act of reconstructing knowledge itself enhances the learning experience. How can you get students to do retrieval practice? If you like, pause the video, I'll wait right here, and see if you can think of some ways. Okay, here are some suggestions. Create opportunities for students to retrieve information. After they're done in their study session, hand them a paper and ask them to write down what they remember. Use testing as a learning tool. Design tests for them specifically, because testing, as we've seen, does improve learning in the sense of that self-test. Teach students how to judge their own learning, and a good way to do this is through the self-assessment. And here's another idea. Often in classrooms, teachers use something called eye clickers, or some way for students to give immediate feedback on a question used in class. So this study looked at using clickers and how they improve performance. So students were given either test questions based on material where there was a clicker question in class. So that means during lecture, a question pops up on the screen and the students have to answer what they think the correct answer is, multiple choice. Those questions on the test were compared to questions where the material was simply presented with no opportunity for the students to do retrieval practice. And when you look at the outcome, you see there's a pretty good bump. Now, it's not huge, but it's there, and it's real. And imagine if every teacher said, I want to improve student performance 10%, I'm going to start putting these questions in. You increase student performance. You allow them the opportunity to test themselves. And it's a win. A small bit of a bump for one student is huge when you think about the learning over the course of a quarter or a semester. It's a really big difference in the individual student's learning. It could be the difference between the processing done by an A student and a B student, and it could mean in 16 years that student remembers twice as much as they learned had they not had that experience. The last area we're going to talk about is metacognition. And metacognition is simply thinking about thinking. or learning about learning. And so in that study comparing concept mapping to retrieval practice, they asked people what they thought. And you see under the heading metacognitive predictions, students said, I think that when I study using concept mapping, I will do better than when I study using retrieval practice. Intuition betrays us, because when you look under actual performance, you should recall that retrieval practice outperformed concept mapping. So our metacognition about this is actually wrong. What students believe will improve their performance may not do so. What they don't think will improve their performance may. And it is our task as instructors to lead them on the path of the ways that will actually improve their performance. So, do you know what you don't know? Are you good at multitasking? Right? Well, there's a nice video from Stephen Chu where he actually shows us some of these things, and here's a still. You see our student studying, right? The book's open and she's got a phone. How often do you see this? How often do you do this? How often do you do multiple things while you're studying? Well, some research, and this is from Brassel and Gibbs, they just wanted to see what happens when you put someone in a room with a computer and a TV. How often do they flip back and forth? So you put on a show you like and you're doing something on the computer. They found that people switch their attention every 14 seconds when you have both the TV and the computer on. So when you're studying on your computer and the TV is on in the background, you think you're switching attention 10 times less. Basically every 140 seconds, every couple of minutes, you think you switch attention. But that's not true. You're actually switching attention every 14 seconds. People have limited memory. We all have limited memory, no matter how smart a person is. And dividing that attention, having a distraction, will reduce performance. If your student studies when they have the TV on in the background, do you think they're going to do as well as if they don't have any distraction going on? In learning rule learning task, another study showed that people were able to both learn a rule and explain the rule. However, when they were multitasking, when they were given a second task to do, they were no longer able to explain the rule. They were unable to access their declarative memory. They could still recognize the unconscious patterns when they were multitasking. But how often is that the kind of learning we're doing? Very often we're required to access our declarative memory, which is our memory for facts, occurrences. When you're studying, those are the kinds of things you're doing. If you're multitasking, if you're trying to watch TV in the background or talking to somebody, very often that information is not being processed. So we are not good at multitasking, even though many people think they are and may argue with you and say, I can multitask, I can use the phone. The results do not show this. Do students know what they've learned? This is another slide from Chu where he shows students predicted how well they did on a test and what their actual percentage was. So on the x-axis is their estimation, on the y-axis is their actual score, and the line across the middle shows if your estimated lines up with your actual. Now, if you estimate you did better than you actually did, your score will be below the line. And when you look at the slide, you see most people's scores are below the line. Most people overestimate their knowledge and they overestimate their performance. And as you look towards the poor performing students, this range was even greater. They did not know how they did. In fact, the lowest performing students actually don't know what they know, and they're very poor at gauging their learning. And some suggestions are weaker students typically have poor metacognition. They are grossly overconfident in their level of understanding, and people who are incompetent typically do not realize how incompetent they are. Other research shows that writing improves metacognition. When a student writes down what they know, their metacognition improves because now they have actual results of what's in their memory. Knowledge of strategies is informed by previous strategy use. When you try different things, when a student tries different things, for this test, I'm not going to study with the TV on in the background. For this test, I am. And they are able to compare their results. And if they actually do the test themselves, they're going to find, wow, when I study and I'm not texting and I'm not watching TV and I'm not surfing the web, when I focus on the information, I do much better. Even though often our intuition tells us multitasking doesn't hurt. In my classes, I encourage students that if they need to text, to leave the room, because the damage to memory, the disruption to memory done by switching to texting, to switching your attention, is so great that you might as well get up and leave the room to do what you have to do. That is how important it is to not try to divide your attention. In fact, much of the research suggests you're better off daydreaming than doing something else. You're bored studying, you want to surf the web, you want to text, guess what? You're better off staring into space for a little while until you're ready to come back to the material. A metacognitive recommendation, a way to improve things, is to use brief, frequent, low-stakes assessments. So let me ask you a question. What would lead to more learning? 5 10-minute study sessions or 4 10-minute study sessions and 1 10-minute recall session? Well, if you said B, you're correct, right? 4 10-minute study sessions and a 1 10-minute recall session should promote much more learning than 5 10-minute study sessions. How about this? Retrieval practice consistently outperforms concept mapping, the self-test. The difference in performance is greater for which type of question? Is it A, an inference question, or B, a verbatim question? This question is a little bit harder because you have to remember the graphs that I showed earlier. And if you look at them, you see that the difference is actually greatest for the questions that students like the most. Your performance increases more for verbatim questions compared to the other methods than it even does for inference questions. Your memory for facts, for declarative information is better when you stop and test yourself. Here's another recall task for you. Write down the key points of this presentation. This should offer you the opportunity to test your own memory, to recreate your knowledge. If you'd like to pause the video, I'll wait here. How I would summarize it would be to say, deep processing leads to long-term learning, right? Shallow processing clearly does not. And after 16 years, half of that information is gone compared to the deep processing people, right? They have twice as much memory for that information compared to the shallow processors. Studying sessions that involve self-testing, recall, have a large positive effect on learning. Better students have good metacognition. And you can actually improve your students' metacognition in some very simple ways. And often one of those ways is to use frequent, brief, low-stakes assessments, right? Not a lot of fear. Even when people have anxiety, test anxiety, when you have frequent, brief, low-stakes assessments, they get an opportunity to test themselves. They don't have to feel that anxiety because they get to see what they know, and this in turn can provide the opportunity for them to improve their knowledge and improve their future studying. And thank you for being a part of this today, and I'd like to thank a couple other people, Carolyn Dufault from the Teaching Center at University of St. Louis, who really gave me a lot of good ideas for this presentation. Dee Gallo and Chris O'Neill here at the Teaching Learning Technology Center, who have been wonderful mentors to me. And here are some information slides if you're interested in following up on any of the studies that I talked about today. I'd like to encourage you to do so, to see where the data come from and to see how it fits into a greater modality of studying and learning. Thank you very much.